Kia ora koutou. Good morning. My name's Steve Dixon. I am the General Manager of Strategy and Partnerships at Toitu. I'm down in Wellington right now. Lovely to have so many of you on board. We had over 200 register, so clearly this is a topic of great interest to people as they begin to work on the how rather than the why. We've got a couple of great speakers for you this morning. So what I want to do is just do a brief introduction to the speakers, lay out some of the ground rules to make a webinar of this type work. Many of these are already familiar to you all, so I will not go too long on that. Then we'll just get into the presentations because we've got a couple of great speakers. They've got a lot of experience in this space, a lot to share. And obviously we want to leave a good amount of time for your questions and our time for answering them. All right, I'd like to start first with a karakia. Māori oho, Māori tū, Māori ora kia tautou, ka tātou. Hau mai e hui e tā hiki e. Just a brief introductory karakia to welcome you all and to bring us all grounded into the webinar today. So my first speaker today is Jane Vargo. Jane works for Maven, which is a consultancy based in Wellington, but works all over the place in Aotearoa. She has over 25 years experience as a consultant, working not only in change management, but also in communications, project management, marketing, and even sales. She's worked in multinationals, but she's also worked significantly with a number of agencies around New Zealand, including Department of Conservation and then Revenue, the Commerce Commission, and Waka Kotahi, NZTA. So Jane is going to give us a kind of an overview of change management, sort of the 101 of change management, if you like. What are the key issues you need to manage? How do you go about it? What does the process look like? It's fair to say there's no single answer to how you might undertake this. We'll wait for Jane to elaborate in that space, but certainly the pace of change as we work with both government agencies and many other clients across New Zealand, the pace of change is significant now. Nobody is unaware of climate change and our government's response to it, and also the consumer and citizen response. School climate strikes, new legislation, the Climate Change Commission, and many other actions, including simple things that affect people's working lives in government, such as the requirement for government fleets to move to EVs, and also for those involved in the carbon neutral government program. You're obviously looking ahead to 2025, thinking, how big is our offsetting bill going to be in 2025 if we don't get going now? So there's a lot of activity. There's a lot of drivers pushing various organisations towards action in this space, and so it's really pertinent to start thinking about how do we manage that? How do we go through this process? And particularly, how do we bring people with us? Because we won't achieve the sorts of gains, the sorts of reductions that we need as a nation, not to mention as organisations, unless we can bring people with us to implement that change alongside us. So with no further ado, I'd like to pass over to you, Jane. Jane will be followed by Dr. Alana Ryan, Director of Sustainability at Massey, and I'll introduce her after Q&A after Jane's presentation. Jane, over to you. Kia ora.
Thank you, Steve. Sorry, I'm a little bit technically challenged here, but there we go. So yes, being asked to talk about change, it's always a challenge because I could talk for hours on change and my experiences. But it's a very intimidating request when you ask somebody to take on a change. Sometimes a lot of people they get caught up in that overwhelming sense of, oh, where do I start? And it is a big task to take on, depending on what your mission is or the expectation of the change is. So once again, these are my experiences. Every change manager experiences things slightly different. We all do things a little differently. So I'm just going to to plow on and share with you the most valuable learnings that I've learned over the last 25 years. So first of all, whenever I get presented with a change from leadership or what have you, I always find it very beneficial to do a lot of investigating, making sure that I understand clearly what the change that I'm meant to deliver, and the expectations around that change, and the outcomes that are expected. Lots of people just get a task and they jump in and they just go through a methodology and a checklist of change activities. I've seen that happen quite a bit. But I feel that the best thing that you can do right from the very start is investigate, ask questions of leadership, because sometimes leadership aren't always on the same page with what they've asked you to do. Ask managers, confirm that this is a real problem that has to be dealt with, and you'll uncover different aspects of what the problem actually is. And it's also a great way to take a temperature check, an initial temperature check of your stakeholders that are being impacted by this change. So once again, just to wrap up that initiation of change, is do your due diligence. So don't just go through a checklist, do the deep dive, find out what are the detailed components of the change, and it sets you up for a successful project, rollout, implementation, whatever your organization calls it. The other thing is, in the beginning, what I've found really valuable is it's an opportunity to influence leadership. So a lot of people think that change is just communicating, one-way communication. We just need to let people know that this change is happening. But that's not what it is. Change has actually changed a lot in the last 10 years. So this is your opportunity to actually get in there and realign some of those expectations with leadership. Let them know that, your activities are not going to be a silver bullet to correct any problems that have occurred in a project or something that's already been implemented. It's also reiterating that it's not going to be a one-way communication stream. It is going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of people effort. And it's not one of those things that once you roll out the change, it's a set and forget. That box is ticked. We've done the change. We've seen that it's been adopted to a marginal measurement. We're just going to be happy with that. It's about continuous improvement. And then the final thing is it's not a cookie cutter approach. So if you have, a method or an approach that you use all the time, you are going to find that you're going to have successful implementations and unsuccessful implementations. It's all about interacting with people, engaging with what the problem is, what perspectives people have on the issue, and then formulating a plan, certainly, but being very flexible to change depending on the insights. So this is where I find right up front, this is your opportunity to influence and kind of change the organization's understanding of what a change initiative really is. Having said that, in my mind, change is as much of an art as it is a science. You have to, I think a good change manager really needs to want to be involved all the time with engaging with people. I have worked with a lot of wonderful change managers. They all have different approaches to change, but stepping back and reflecting on, you know, successes of implementation or rate of adoption to their change initiatives, the ones that are on the ground, engaging with people, not just reporting to stakeholders on how the change is progressing, those ones that are really getting their hands into it are more successful, I find. There's a lot of obvious resistance to change. I mean, people don't like change. We tend to be creatures of habit, whether we like to admit that or not. I find that if resistance is going to happen, it's going to be because they haven't been clearly informed of the details of the change. They haven't been given enough notice. So, you know, those surprise changes or a dictatorship kind of tone of a change, like we're going to be doing things differently from tomorrow onwards. No wonder people don't get, you know, on the bandwagon with your program. You also have to factor in that there are other things going on in people's lives, personal things that can affect your change initiative. And you just have to be aware of that. You don't have to know the details, but you just have to be aware that people have lives outside of the office and things happen in those times that can affect what you do, and how you interact with people and how they interact back with you. So you definitely, when you're rolling out a change initiative, you do have waves of those days where you can think, that was a great day. I feel like I got all my messaging across the line. People seem to be coming along on the journey. And then the next day, at the end of the day, when you think about it, you're like, oh, what happened? What happened today? Everything's derailed. It's all about persistence and consistency. The other big resistance is that people have experienced change rolled out poorly. You know, we're actually just coming out of a real 10-year time frame that I've witnessed in public sector where there's been a lot of mistrust because leadership has just announced a change but not really backed it up or provided support for that change, and it's just gone over poorly. So anytime these days that you're initiating change, you're kind of up against that historical experience. Everybody kind of thinks, oh, great, here we go again. But that's not necessary. You know, how you approach the change, how you engage with people, you can all change that and have a better outcome. So I'm seeing a lot of that in the sector as well going on. And the other thing that I've noticed, probably my top three, is that leadership has oversold a change. So they basically said, we're doing this change because of these 5 reasons. And yes, the reasons might be very, you know, needed, and people can understand why we need the change, but they've oversold it. They've said that they've highlighted benefits. They've said that, you know, we're going to reach these targets that realistically aren't really that achievable. I mean, they'll achieve them, but everybody's thinking that, oh, the problem will be solved instantly. So I'm really careful, and I advise people that I work with in the change space, don't oversell it. Be fully transparent. So if people ask you, well, your change is going to impact another process, that is outside your area or outside the scope of the change, investigate that. Find out if that's true. Find out how it possibly does impact other areas. That is really what you should be investigating in your impact assessment. But sometimes these things pop up through the whole journey, and don't just, it's not advisable to just get blinders on and focus on delivering your change. As insights come up, investigate them. It may change your standing a little bit. So I find that flexibility, while having a plan, is probably the secret to a lot of change initiatives. Personally, I always have a framework that I work with. There's lots of change managers that use Cotter, 7 to 8 steps. There is the Kubler approach, the 5 stages of grief, understanding resistance and stuff like that. The framework that I tend to rely on is ProSci. I find that it makes sense, and I've always taken the view that if the change makes sense to me, then it will be easy to deliver. It'll make sense to the average person. And ProSci tends to support that. So I always advise change people to just be comfortable with the framework that they choose. And I like ProSci because they start with ADKAR. That just is an exercise of basically temperature checking, finding out the awareness that people have of the change, the desire to change, the knowledge and capability. Are they able to change, or is there an impediment that I have to factor in to my change plan and my approach? And then, as you can see on this slide, they go through, there's just short phases to go through in this framework. So I do think a framework is definitely necessary, but I always advise not to be married to it. Don't think that you have to include absolutely every step of a framework, because organizations are all different. People are all different. And so there's some steps that just may not be needed simply. So then you move into developing your change plan after you've done all your investigating and you're comfortable with the expectations that are asked of you as are asked of your change team, and you start to develop the core things in the change plan. So you obviously have a vision, you have your sponsorship group, you're starting to collect insights, and you've done your risk assessments. All of these are core things and muchly needed. This will give you, your outline of how you're going to engage with your stakeholders, how you're going to communicate with them, what type of communication methods they like. Is training going to be necessary? Is it, a process that requires in-depth training? Or is it an IT application that requires technical training? So you go on to develop this plan that helps you carve out your activities. And those activities can be anything, really. You factor in your company culture, the type of change that it is, part of your change plan, and you basically go through and assess high value, high impact change activities. Now, one thing that I have seen over the years is that because a change manager has picked a framework, the framework has advised that they should do 26 different activities. I always say, whoa, let's just start off with 3. Let's pick 3 high value, high impact change activities, and let's test them. So kind of like experiments. see if they work, see if they resonate with people. And some of these things could be a change network. In most cases, you're going to find that a change network, especially since we work in different locations, is vitally important, but not always necessary. It is totally dependent on the change. And these are people that are in your inner circle of how you're trying to implement the change and roll it out. And you're going to converse with these people a lot more than you are the stakeholders that are being impacted, because you have to support this network so that they can answer and support those people that are being impacted out in the wider space. You can do demonstrations if you're rolling out an IT application that changes processes. Business value demonstrations as you're prototyping the application are very valuable. You can incorporate those quite easily into lunch and learns, and it lets people see that, oh, it's not all just talk. They are actually doing something in this project, and they are actually taking the change seriously. It also gives people that will potentially be users of that product or process an opportunity to feed back into the work that's being done. So it's very much real-time, two-way interactions that you're trying to achieve. It's not just announcements. It's not just getting leadership to give updates on the intranet. It is very important for leadership at strategic points in time in your change implementation to actually come to the table and be the public face of the change. But it doesn't need to be necessarily weekly. You need to finesse out what the best timing for those things is going to be. So these activities tend to start off as little experiments, and you refine them as you go through the change journey. Other things that are really staple in a change plan are obviously the storytelling. Once again, storytelling is one-way communication. You're just basically advertising what you're doing in your change space. So I find that I can have those kind of one-way piece communications going on at factored in times on static sites like intranets or newsletters or what have you. And so they can be running on their own course, but I really, really like the engagement part, and the engagement will tell me if, how often I need to check in with people and all that kind of stuff. So really think about the high value, high impact activities. And then you start working your plan. So you get into an iterative approach to your activities. The ones that you've chosen, the ones that you've kind of tweaked and they seem to work well. And you go through an exercise of checkpoints and milestones. And again, just be prepared to change as the insights are collected. As you're doing these iterative activities, you're carefully rolling it into BAU activities. And this is where the adoption and embedding part happens. So if you imagine that you're doing your change activities, they can be very public activities and a lot of hype around them, but then they automatically go into a BAU activity cycle. That is where you're going to find that people really have adopted the change, they're using it, there's no going back. That's your success factor. And then just to wrap up, some of the lessons that I've learned are in the end of my presentation, but I'm always, in leading change, I'm looking to always understand and learn from people. You don't know everything as a change person, so be prepared and humbled by what you're going to learn. If leadership don't articulate the need of the change fully, you're well within your right to have them explain it and go back and define the change. Your middle management is your key supporter for the change, so be prepared to support them and listen to what they need from you as a change manager for that support. And basically, the role of a change manager is a service role. It's being supportive, it's being helpful, it's being flexible and patient and open-minded. So you're asking for insights to roll out a change. You have to be prepared to consider those insights and change tact, not be married to your plan. So these are some of the things that I've learned over the 25 years that I've been in change. If you have any questions, feel free to get a hold of me. I'm more than happy to answer them.
Hey, thank you, Jane. And people are ahead of you because there are questions already awaiting you. So thanks for that. Let's kick into the questions. So a couple from Gemma. What performance measures are you using and how are these developed? How are you measuring success or progress, I guess?
Yeah, so that is a very important aspect. Now, you know, you can standardize your measurement. You can, you know, qualitative and quantitatively. What I find is most successful is at the beginning of a change, you sit down with leadership and the managers and you develop those measurements so they can be very customized. Try to stay away from standardizing your measurements. Build in checkpoints so that you can regularly engage with those measurements.
Perfect, thank you. Gemma also has a question about what constitutes carbon sequestration, which is slightly left field and out of the change space. I'll give you an answer to that, Gemma. Sequestration is a biological process. It's not the same as a carbon credit because carbon credits come from lots of different sources like renewable energy. Sequestration is simply the absorption of carbon into a living thing such as a tree, which is our most common sequestration. It becomes part of the roots, it becomes part of the trunk, it becomes part of the branches and the leaves. So that's what sequestration is. It occurs in a variety of biological processes, including wetlands, including peat soils, and including soil itself. But of course, what gets sequestered can also be released. So that's why it's such a hot topic and an issue of debate all over the place, is because you can lose your sequestration from biological sources as easily as you can gain it. A question from Roger. Would you recommend anything different for a situation where the organisation needs to change to meet the expectations of staff rather than the other way around? Putting it another way, do you have any tips for changing behaviour of leadership rather than staff?
Basically, I have encountered that once or twice in my career, and I think it is about training leadership. I think it is about being involved in leadership and people leader conversations. So inserting yourself as a change person into people leader meetings so that you have a voice, so that you slowly over time can influence positive change and positive perspectives of how to implement change in an organization. It all takes time, and it is just training.
Very good. The Prosky method, a question from Anonymous, does this integrate with the Agile approach? So can they be run in parallel?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that thinking. So any framework can be transformed into an Agile approach. I'm very much for a lean management approach. I also read a lot about lean, fast, quick change. So like I mentioned in the presentation, you do have a framework. It is a complete framework. So ProSci is a complete end-to-end framework. You don't have to do every one of those recommendations. There are staple things that I definitely think that you need to incorporate and never deviate from, but that doesn't slow down the agile part of it. There's a very good author, Jason Little, who does lean change management, and he has a wonderful book. And that's exactly what it's called, is lean change management. And he basically shows you how to take something like ProSci and turn it into a very agile change plan.
Very good. One last question before we move on. Question from Gavin. On slide 6, you mentioned several change frameworks and encourage us to pick one and go for it. What advice do you offer about possibly switching methodology tracks on a mid-process if temperatures in inverted commas change?
Yeah, you know what? A lot of people a lot of colleagues that I've worked with, once they pick a framework, they like to stick with it. I'm not of that mindset. The framework should always just sit with the change manager and the change team that you are incorporating to help you with this change. It's not something that, it's like a religion, really. It's not something that you put out there as the best, greatest, only way to do things. I often cherry pick. So I will go between Cotter and ProSci as needed. What I'm looking for, what helps me drive any activity, is insights. I'm wanting to know if people like to sit down face to face and talk things through. Do they like to see a demonstration? That is supported by all the frameworks out there. So I cherry pick, definitely.
Very good, very good. A quick question from Helen. What was the name of the author again?
Jason Little. Little.
Little. Right. Very good. Okay. We'll hold on to your question, Martin, because I think it's relevant for both speakers at the end. So we'll hold on to that for now. I want to kick on now with Dr. Alana Ryan from Massey University. So we're moving from the theoretical, if you like, valuable and important, but theoretical, into the practical. So how does this really work on the ground? Now, Massey's been a client of Toitu's for a number of years. They have made real progress. So there's undoubtedly some useful insights that Alana can share. Over to you, Alana.
I'll just share my screen.
And as we go, don't forget, keep the Q&A, just keep it rolling as we go. You don't need to hold on to the questions until the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Jane, for your introduction, and kia ora koutou, everyone. Look, I'm really happy to be able to talk with you today about our experience at Massey and to share some of that. I'm not sure we've made as much progress in terms of reducing our emissions yet, but we're certainly well on the way to understanding them better and to having a plan in place. And I want to talk a little bit about what the experience of that has been for us at Massey and what I've learnt from that experience, and also to share a little bit about some of the underlying the underpinning kind of theory. So I work very much from an adaptive leadership perspective. I can't remember the names of the authors of the book that I use, American authors, but their work has been picked up by a lot of people, and in particular the work of Leith Sharp, who is at the Harvard Executive Education for Sustainability Leadership program, and I met with her and a number of other university colleagues a couple of years ago. So I'm really indebted to her work, and there's a link on my slides if people want to follow that up. The approach that she uses, particularly in the university context, but really in any complex organisation, about how to get change around sustainability. So I've called what I'm talking about today what works where, because as I've found as I've gone through this process of trying to get change at the university, that there isn't one approach which works for every part of the university or for every source of emission. We're quite a large organisation, quite unique even within the university sector. So I want to talk a little bit about the kinds of approaches that we've used and what's worked, what hasn't worked, and so on. So just to move on, I guess I wanted to start by saying it's really important to understand two things before you start, or as you start, or all the way through the whole process. And so Jane has mentioned some of this. Understanding your emissions is one really important part, and I'll talk a little bit about our emissions because that's helped guide what we've done as a university, but also obviously understanding the organisation. So for Massey, we have 3 campuses in 3 very different cities. A greenfield site, which was developed about 25 years ago at Albany on the North Shore of Auckland. The Manawatu site, which started as an agricultural college in 1926, and a Wellington site, which was the old Wellington Polytech. So very different physical sites, and also even culture, organisational culture within those campuses. We have, I guess, in terms of who our key stakeholders are, we have 30,000 students on those 3 campuses, and at distance, about half of those are actually at distance, and we have 3,300 staff. So I work with a colleague, Sal Lampkin, who's our Sustainability Transformation Manager, and she often talks about these 33,000 people as our team, really. So although there's a team of 2.5 in terms of the Sustainability Office, doing the work that we're doing around climate change, we've got this much bigger team of people who are going to help make the change. But as a university, we're also quite different from other organisations, and even within the public sector. So our main business is obviously education and research. So that really frames a lot of what we do and how we approach climate action change in terms of not just emission reduction, but also linking that to our core business as a university. And then just in terms of the key sources of emissions, for us, it's air travel, energy and farms. And I'm going to talk in particular about those 3 and about the challenge of reducing those over time. But just in terms of that image on the right there, about this is the kind of, everybody we're familiar with an organisational chart, we all have them. They're the kind of formally recognised structure of the university. It was really important to understand that organisational structure. And when I came into this role 5 years ago, I had come from being a head of school, and I knew quite well the academic part of the university, but much less so the service and professional side and the operational part. So for me, it was important to understand what that organisational structure was in terms of facility services, campus operations, procurement, so on. So understanding that formal authority lines was important, and also understanding key decision-making committees and so forth. But actually, even more important than that is the kind of mess which is behind the organisational charts. It's actually where people really work. So often, everybody's familiar about talking about silos. So the university is a very siloed organisation, but actually there are some people who are quite good at working across the silos that are not precious about maintaining control over their business, but want to work with others. So learning about that has been really helpful, because that's enabled me to find ways that I can make change by looking to the people who really want to move outside of their silos and to connect across, because they understand what the big picture is in terms of the university, what we're trying to do. Anyway, as I talk, some of that messiness of the organisation will become clearer. But just to say a little bit about our emissions, so this is from our 2018 baseline, so this was verified in 2019, and you'll see there that our main emissions, like most universities, are actually, or a very large chunk of them, come from air travel, because as an organisation, we are globally connected, and most academics travel overseas for conferences and research and so forth. So international air travel is the single largest emission source for us. So we're like most universities in that respect. Unlike other universities though, because we have 2,200 hectares of farmland, we have 7 farms, a large proportion of our emissions also comes from those biological emissions from animals, so it's about 27%. And then the other big chunk for most organisations is energy, and of that 27% or 28% of emissions from energy, about 60% of that comes from natural gas. So it's been important for me to understand, and for the organisation to understand, where our biggest emission sources are based, because we want to, I suppose, put our energy into those where we can make the biggest impact. But obviously there are a lot of challenges associated with those emission sources and how we can get some change there. Just to say a little bit, I suppose, about the kind of official story, which all organisations have about the sustainability journey that they've been on. So as I said, I took on this role 5 years ago, and the first thing I did was to develop a sustainability framework, which was kind of co-created with staff and students in the organisation. Very high level document, really had nothing very concrete in it, but some goals that we were to work towards. But very quickly it became clear that the critical issue to focus on as an organisation was around climate change. And so then sort of really moved to making a focus around that. And I guess the critical decision that was made by the senior leadership team in 2019 was that as a university we would aspire and achieve net zero carbon goal by 2030. How we were to get there was unknown initially. So we've done a lot of work in the last year and a half in developing a climate action plan in draft form, which is available from the website. It's still in draft form, but will be approved, hopefully, the new version in the next month or two by SLT. And we did a big piece of work around, first of all, understanding our emissions, but then mapping that pathway to carbon zero around our key emission source areas. But that kind of official story doesn't really tell the real story of what we've done at the university. And I guess I wanted to iterate that, like any organisation trying to make change, you might have a plan, and Jane has said this as well, be prepared to be flexible and to deviate from the plan. And there's a phrase that Leith Sharp uses all the time, which is about the squiggle. So she says it's all about the squiggle. So that's that little image there. There is no straight line to getting to your goal. There will be times when you make a start somewhere and that works, and then that it doesn't work and you've got to change direction. So being prepared to and being open to the sort of vagaries of organisations and their abilities to make change or not make changes is a really important part of this job. I also wanted to say something about mandate, because I think I certainly thought that getting that mandate of being net zero carbon by 2030 would make everything happen. Basically, so SLT has said we're going to get there, and everybody else in the university would now get in behind us, and we would be well on the way to doing that. So we had two kind of key mandates. One is that net zero carbon goal, and another key one about all new builds will be 5 Green Star equivalent. And I have to say that although that mandate has provided some, the goal and direction, but it hasn't really provided necessarily the engagement that we've needed in the university. So that's had to be built up over time with people, some of whom are willing to get on board, some of whom are less willing, and sometimes for very good reasons, because the nature of their role in the university makes the degree of change that's required much more difficult. I guess so one of the things that I've learned is that it's really important to get alongside the kind of key budget holders and responsible parties, understanding their pain, what's difficult for them, and trying to help find solutions for their job, for the things that they are challenged by. And as I said earlier, each of our key emission source areas is quite different and has required a different approach. So I'm just going to say something about the 3 main ones, but also about waste. So although waste is a very small component of our emissions, it's one which is highly visible. A lot of staff and students have been interested in. So just in terms of the energy piece, and getting traction from those in the organisation who are responsible for energy. So that's our facility services teams. We have capital projects teams who are responsible for the big major builds and major capital expenditure, and also facility services managers who are responsible for energy on our campuses. So obviously to decarbonise our energy requires big money, scary numbers, millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. And we have infrastructure, particularly on the Manawatu campus, which is aged and which is really at its limit. So this is a really difficult one to crack as an organisation. We people who are working in the space, whether it's new builds or those who are managing energy on site. Budgets are already committed, and there's very little wriggle room within them to start spending new money. And the organisation, like everybody impacted by COVID, and because universities have lost a lot of international students, therefore our ability to spend into new areas is limited. Having new capital expenditure through our 10-year capital plan is difficult to get. So it's a difficult issue to get hold of. But in this space, I would say that mandate has helped in terms of shifting the dial a little bit and getting some traction around this. But more importantly, it's having data and feasibility studies which can show the savings that we can generate by switching from natural gas to a non-fossil fuel alternative, or by building refurbishments in our new buildings, making sure that they are low carbon. And so being able to show very concrete data is really helpful. And it also doesn't hurt to get additional funding through ECA, which we have used. They've helped parts fund our Energy Transition Accelerator piece of work, and also feasibility studies around energy and carbon performance. So just showing the detail's not important, but that's a nice piece of work which was done by Becca for us on our library transformation project, and just really showing how scenario 2C, which was the concept design, which is about a very improved facade for a very old building, and getting rid of natural gas makes a huge improvement in terms of energy savings, kilowatt hours, but also carbon. So in terms of this, that energy piece, having mandate, having data, feasibility studies, and external sources of money has obviously been really helpful. But in a very different context, as I said, our single largest source of emissions, which comes from international air travel, that approach doesn't work. It's a very different context and issue. And in fact, it doesn't cost us anything to reduce travel in terms of money. In fact, it saves us money. But it's a big issue that we need to look at, and something which we need to work through. So in terms of the context, universities are globally connected. To maintain our reputation, we need to maintain connectivity with colleagues, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, but also in Australia and the Pacific. Early career academics are often very concerned to be able to build their academic careers by having connections with their international colleagues. We have had to learn from the experience, I guess, of COVID, where suddenly we couldn't do any of that, and suddenly academics have had to connect through this kind of medium of Zoom. So conferences have been able to continue, but in a very different context. And also that in generally the context, if we have less travel, we've got savings that we can use. But how are we going to use them? So I guess the biggest issue that we face, though, in this context is that we need to co-create a solution which is not a top-down one. So we've gone through a process of working with academics and professional staff through a survey and workshops, providing them with a safe context and environment to explore ideas so that they can work through what would actually work in terms of remaining globally connected with colleagues, but also bringing down our emissions around international air travel. But we also need to make sure that we connect that work with internal decision makers and with those who are in that middle management sector, which are very important, and also the senior leadership team. So there's a kind of iterative process of trying to design a solution which will be based probably through revised leave policies and travel policies, but that has to work both for management, senior leadership team, and for academics. And it really, at its base, it's going to require a cultural change. And so the question about what does actually a post-2020 academic look like is really important to making some change in that space. So that's a very active area for us at the moment, and we're still working through that. Another space where just sort of using mandate will not bring changes around the farm. So in this context, the farms are expected to make a commercial return to the university. and they are also a research and teaching platform, and they're very much linked to the university's reputation. So how in that space do we get the kind of reduction in emissions that we need, but also maintain a vibrant teaching and research platform, which means that actually the goal of reducing emissions has to be balanced with the need to have an active research agenda on those farms. So we're very much still in the process of trying to work that out, and very much a collaborative process. We trying to decide what our vision will be and a plan around that, using a working group of academics and farm managers as well, doing some modelling, working very much with researchers, trying to understand the issues from their point of view. So some stakeholder interviews were done last year to help do that. And then we're in this process of creating a low carbon roadmap for the farms. So the vision is not just about cutting emissions, but also it's how, as a university, we will use those farms to show how, as a sector in Aotearoa New Zealand, also we can lead the transition that's needed to a low carbon agricultural and horticultural sector. But it's very much about getting the right people in the room and making sure that they are part of that conversation, because if they're not in the room creating what the change is going to be, we're not going to get what we require. Then finally, just again on waste, as I said, it's a very small component of our emissions. It's less than 1%, but of all the emails I get from staff and students and complaints about the university, it's about waste. So it's an important one for us to focus on, because it does help to engage staff and students and for them to feel that they're part of an organisation that's making change. And so the focus for us has really been around catalysing both contractors and student engagement. So we've just gone through a process of renegotiating our contracts with our suppliers. We have different ones on each of the campuses, and we're using KPIs around diversion of waste from landfill to help us improve our diversion rates. But we're also using their ability to advise us through their sustainability organisational knowledge to work with campus operations staff and get that change. And then in terms of student engagement, students are often saying, how can we help? We want the university to be more sustainable. What can we do? And so one of the things we're doing is some small pilots, and starting with the Palmerston North City Council are helping us with this on the Manawatu campus and the student accommodation around diverting food waste from landfill into composting. So we're using the idea of a pilot in a small scale way to see if we can understand what the problems are, because cross-contamination, as we know, is always the big issue around waste, and then shifting, understanding what works in one small context, and then scaling that up across the organisation. So I know I just rattled through this. I just want to now finish with this slide, which I have shamelessly stolen from you, Jane. Thank you. And just to kind of say that at the moment, in terms of the carbon management plan that the university is developing, so we have a climate action plan, which is very high level. The carbon management plan will have much more specific targets and implementation plan, mid-level targets and milestones and so forth. So we're kind of in that little red area at the moment, is that we've developed a lot of that, of the understanding about what needs to be done. By the end of the year, we will have a carbon management plan, which will have a lot of detail in it, and then we'll be moving into that, hopefully embedding that as BAU, so that therefore it becomes just part of, well, this is how the university now manages its carbon. But what I would say is I would imagine even within that BAU process, there will still be a lot of moments where we need to revisit possibly some of the decisions or getting people on board. So I see this as an active process that will take quite a long time to be embedded culturally in the organisation. So I think I'll finish there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Lana, thank you very much. I'm glad you're happy to take questions, because they're coming in droves. I want to pop back to Martin Fry's question, because it's been repeated by others, and it's all about managing up. So the number of questions about how do you manage that internal inherent human resistance to change, but particularly in middle management, and how do you how do you kind of get their heads around it? You touched on it in your presentation, but I'd be interested in both Jane and your views on how you might go about that.
Yeah, it's really important. So what I found work is really understanding what matters to them in terms of what are their responsibilities. And so in terms of at a university, the senior leadership team is made up primarily of academic leaders of colleges, and then we have the operational HR, so forth. So they have very different senses of what's important to them and what they need to deliver on, and understanding that's really important to get senior leadership team to agree to things. But then the level below that, in terms of the kind of facility services, campus operations, procurement, they have a lot of constraints on them in terms of how much money they've got in an annual budget to spend, how much staff they have, whether or not they've got the capability around that. So I found that really understanding where the pain is from their end, and really understanding that, and not just thinking I understand, or possibly I still don't really understand it, but I'm constantly trying to understand it, and then to talk back with them about where the organisation is trying to go, what they're responsible for, and how can we bring those two things together. And so what I try to do is to find ways to help them deliver what they need to deliver, but also understanding in the context of the kind of carbon agenda. And so some of it is happens more easily, depending, some of it's personality, but some of it's also just some parts of the organisation are much more difficult to shift because of the huge amounts of money that are associated with that. So facility services and the capital expenditure is the hardest to get moving because it costs so much money, but it it's something that which we continue to work through.
Jane, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely. I have to apply those change options at the management level, but first and foremost, it's collaborating with them, understanding their pain points, putting suggestions out to them so that they can collaborate with you, as opposed to just doing something to them with good intention. But yeah.
Very good. You might want to check your mic. I think it might have dropped off. I can hear you just, but you're a bit distant. Look, we're running out of time, but there's another series of questions all about air travel. Now we're going to be running a webinar specifically on how do you move mindsets? How do you help people get out of aeroplanes? But people are interested, Lana, in your experience around trying to take away travel as a perk, people adding holidays to international conferences. And this is a dynamic not just in academia, this is across government and large organizations.
Yep.
How have you gone about this, and what have you managed to achieve?
Well, we're still, as I said, in a kind of discovery phase really about what the issues are. I think there's a couple of things. So so the perk thing, I guess, is one thing. For the university, we've got some perverse incentives around leave, which have to do with you can take short leave for 23 days or longer leave. The pots of money that are applied to spend for that are different, and they have a different implication in terms of what you're expected to deliver on. So we need, as an organisation, need to look at those policies to make sure that we're aligning so leave and overseas leave is really important. So, but how can we encourage people to bunch up travel rather than taking a whole lot of, often maybe some academics will take 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 hops across to Australia a year, and that's clearly not very good. So how do we encourage possibly going for a longer period of time to get more benefit out of it? But I think so for us, it's understanding how the academic work cycle is and how that connects with teaching and the importance of PBRF and all of those things. So I think it will be different in different organisations. So that's how we're trying to understand that, and then come up with a process which will enable people to feel that they're not just being told they can't ever travel overseas, which we think is not very tenable.
No, yeah, and this is a very challenging space, and like I say, we'll be running a webinar in the future, focusing on kind of what are the best tips and tricks, what's worked out there for public agencies and others. So we may well be calling on you. Alana to help us in that space. We are running out of time. In fact, we have run out of time. Everybody, you will get the presentation sent to you by email, so look out for your emails. So that is coming. But I want to finish with a couple of very quick questions, Alana, if you can give me kind of almost one-word answers. Are your buildings at Massey going to be neighbours rated?
Not currently. So
Not.
might be, but not at the moment.
No, okay. And very final comment, because I can see people need to drop off and get on with other things. But could you say a little bit more about your journey to carbon neutral, the decision around going carbon neutral 2030?
Gosh.
Maybe that's not a quick one, eh?
It's not really a quick one, and I suspect that the decision was made and it happened pre-COVID, without fully understanding what the cost was and what the difficulties were. And if I'd gone and asked for that decision after COVID, we might have got a different decision. So, sorry.
An inspirational decision.
Rather random.
Not necessarily a bad decision, but one made perhaps without what Jane would suggest, enough evidence gathering in advance to see that you can deliver it. Look, we need to close up. Sorry to those whose questions we didn't all get to. But look, thank you all for your attendance. Lots of really good questions. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Alana, for your wisdom and your insights. I want to close with a karakia, and then we can get on with our day. Hope it's sunny where you are. It certainly is in Wellington. Maori oho, Maori tū, Maori ora ki a tātou, hau mai e hui e tā hiti e. Kia ora tātou.
Thank you.